Good evening. My name is Cole, and tonight I'll be sharing a batch of scary stories that'll keep you looking over your shoulder long after the video ends. These aren't ghost tales or paranormal mysteries. These are the darker, human stories that remind us danger can lurk in the most ordinary places. So grab a blanket, get comfortable, dim the lights, and settle in as we dive into these chilling encounters. The first story comes from someone who learned that hotel walls aren't as protective as we'd like to believe. I travel for work pretty frequently, so I'm used to staying in hotels. Usually I can fall asleep anywhere, but something about this particular place felt off from the moment I checked in. It was one of those older establishments where the carpets had seen better days, and the hallways seemed to stretch on forever under flickering fluorescent lights. My room was on the 3rd floor, nothing special. I'd settled in around 10, watched some TV, and crashed around midnight. Everything seemed normal until I woke up at exactly 2 a.m. to the sound of metal on metal. Someone was jiggling the handle of my door. At first I thought maybe it was housekeeping or maintenance, but then I remembered it was the middle of the night. The jiggling continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing to see if the door was locked. My heart started pounding as I lay there in the dark, listening to this rhythmic rattling that seemed to go on forever. I crept out of bed as quietly as possible and tiptoed to the door. The jiggling had stopped, but I could sense someone was still out there. I pressed my eye to the peephole, expecting to see an empty hallway or maybe someone walking away. Instead, there was a man standing directly in front of my door. He wasn't moving at all, just standing there perfectly still, staring straight ahead. What made my blood run cold was that he seemed to be looking directly back at me through the peephole, like he knew I was watching. His eyes were wide open and he wasn't blinking. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I waited for what felt like an hour, checking the peephole periodically. Each time, he was still there in the exact same position, staring with those unblinking eyes. He never moved, never shifted his weight, never even seemed to breathe. Finally, around 4 a.m, I worked up the courage to look one more time. The hallway was empty. I called the front desk to report it, but they said their security cameras had malfunctioned that night, and there was no record of anyone on the 3rd floor. They offered to move me to another room, but I just packed my bags and left. I still don't know what that man wanted, or why he stood there for hours without moving. But I'll never forget those unblinking eyes staring back at me through that tiny piece of glass. The poster never got answers about who that man was or what he wanted. There's something deeply unsettling about someone who can stand motionless for hours in a hotel hallway, especially when they seem to know exactly where you're watching from. Hotels are supposed to be temporary refuges. Sometimes they become stages for encounters we can't explain. The fact that the security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned that night just adds another layer of unease to an already disturbing experience. Speaking of places that should feel safe but don't, our next story takes us to what should have been a peaceful mountain retreat. I booked a cabin rental for a long weekend, hoping to get away from the city and clear my head. The place was perfect, tucked away in the mountains with no neighbors for miles. The listing mentioned it was secluded, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I hiked the trails, read by the fireplace, and enjoyed the kind of silence you can only find in the wilderness. But when night fell, that silence became something else entirely. I was settling into bed around 11 when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking back and forth outside the front door. At first I thought it might be an animal, but the rhythm was too regular, too human. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. The porch light was motion activated, but it wasn't on, which seemed strange if something was moving out there. I couldn't see anything through the darkness, but the footsteps continued for another 10 minutes before finally stopping. The next morning, I decided to investigate. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in a pristine white blanket. I walked around the entire cabin, looking for any sign of what might have caused those sounds. What I found made my stomach drop. There were no footprints leading up to the cabin from any direction. The snow around the porch was completely undisturbed, but there were footprints leaving the porch, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the tree line. Someone or something had been on my porch, but there was no evidence of how they'd gotten there. It was like they'd materialized out of thin air, walked around for a while, then vanished back into the forest. I spent the rest of the weekend jumping at every sound, and I never did figure out what left those tracks. The rental company had no explanation either. They just said the mountains could be mysterious sometimes, like that was supposed to make me feel better. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I'm not sure I ever will. The mystery of footprints that only lead away from a place touches something primal in our brains. We're wired to understand cause and effect, entrance and exit. When those patterns break down, our minds struggle to fill in the gaps. The poster experienced something that defied basic logic, and sometimes that's more terrifying than any monster or intruder could be. Our next encounter involves technology turning against its owner in the most unsettling way possible. I'm usually a pretty heavy sleeper, so when my phone started ringing at 3 a.m, it took me a while to fully wake up. I fumbled around in the dark, annoyed that someone would call so late. But when I looked at the screen, my blood went cold. The caller ID showed my own number. My phone was calling itself. I stared at the screen for a few rings, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This had to be some kind of glitch, right? Maybe a problem with the phone company's system. But the ringing was so loud in the quiet house that I finally answered just to make it stop. The moment I put the phone to my ear, a voice whispered, "Don't go back to sleep." It wasn't my voice, but it wasn't completely unfamiliar either. It sounded like someone doing a very poor imitation of me. Like they were trying to match my tone, but couldn't quite get it right. The words were drawn out and breathy, almost like the person was speaking through water. I hung up immediately and checked my call log. The call showed as lasting 37 seconds, but I knew I'd only been on the line for maybe 5. I called my phone company the next day, but they had no record of any call at that time. According to their system, my phone hadn't been used between midnight and 6 a.m. I tried to convince myself it was just some kind of technical error, but that voice keeps echoing in my head. The way it said my words, but wrong, like someone wearing a mask of my voice that didn't quite fit. I haven't been sleeping well since then. Every time I start to drift off, I remember that whispered warning and wonder who or what was trying to keep me awake. When our own technology seems to develop a mind of its own, it shakes our trust in the tools we depend on every day. The poster faced something that shouldn't be possible, a call from their own number, with a voice that almost sounded like theirs, but not quite. It's the digital equivalent of looking in a mirror and seeing something that's almost your reflection, but fundamentally wrong. Sometimes, the most ordinary workplaces become stages for the extraordinary, as our next story demonstrates. I work at a mid-sized clothing store, and sometimes I have to stay late to finish inventory or reset displays. I actually prefer the evening shifts because the store gets quiet and I can focus without customers interrupting every few minutes. Last Thursday, I was working alone, organizing the new arrivals section near the back of the store. The mannequins in that area had been giving me an uneasy feeling all week. There's something about their blank faces and perfect poses that seems almost too lifelike when you're alone with them. I was hanging up a rack of blouses when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. One of the female mannequins had turned its head slightly, just enough that it was now looking in my direction instead of straight ahead. I froze, telling myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the lighting. Mannequins don't move, but I could swear the angle of its head was different from when I'd walked past it earlier. I tried to focus on my work, but I kept glancing over at that mannequin. Each time I looked, it seemed like its position had shifted just a little more. Not dramatically, just subtle changes that made me question what I'd seen before. Around 9 o'clock, the automatic lights started shutting off section by section as the timers kicked in. I was supposed to finish up and lock the store by 9:30, so I hurried through the last of my tasks. When I came back to collect my jacket from the break room, I had to walk through the darkened new arrivals section. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate between the racks and displays. That's when I saw the mannequin clearly. Its arms, which had been positioned at its sides when I'd first noticed it, were now stretched out toward the walkway like it was reaching for something, or someone. I got out of there so fast, I nearly tripped over a clothing rack. The next morning, I asked my manager if anyone else had been in the store after I left. She checked the security logs and said no one had entered or exited the building until the opening crew arrived at 7. I requested to be moved to day shifts only. Some people think I'm being ridiculous, but they haven't seen those blank eyes tracking movement in the dark. Sometimes it's the familiar places that betray our sense of safety most completely. When something as mundane as a clothing store becomes a stage for the impossible, it forces us to question everything we think we know about the world around us. The poster discovered that being alone with mannequins after hours isn't just uncomfortable because of their lifeless faces. Sometimes those faces aren't as lifeless as they should be. Let me take you down another path of uncertainty with our next story, one that starts on what should have been an ordinary drive. I was driving home late one night from visiting my sister, taking the back roads to avoid highway traffic. It's a route I've driven dozens of times, mostly farmland and scattered houses, nothing remarkable. But something felt different that night, though I couldn't put my finger on what. About 20 minutes into the drive, I passed an old house set back from the road. I'd never really noticed it before, but that night it caught my attention because every single window was blazing with warm yellow light. It looked almost festive, like they were having a party or celebration. It made me smile, the sight. There's something comforting about seeing a house full of life in the middle of nowhere, especially on a cold November night. I made a mental note to wave if I saw anyone next time I passed by. But as I continued down the road, something nagged at me. The house had looked familiar, but also wrong somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen it in a different state before. About 10 minutes later, curiosity got the better of me. I turned around and drove back to take another look. Maybe I'd imagined how bright it was, or maybe I wanted to see if there really was some kind of gathering happening. When I reached the spot where the house should have been, I slowed down and searched the roadside carefully. There it was, set back in the same position, but now it was completely dark. Not just dim or quiet. Every window was black, and the whole place had that hollow, abandoned look that empty houses get. I pulled over and stared at the building through my windshield. The structure was obviously old and neglected. The porch was sagging, some of the window frames were rotted out, and weeds had grown up around the foundation. This wasn't a house where anyone had lived for years, let alone one that had been blazing with lights just minutes before. I sat there for maybe 15 minutes, watching for any sign of movement or illumination. Nothing. The house remained as dark and dead-looking as any abandoned building I'd ever seen. I tried to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Maybe I'd confused it with another house, though there weren't any other buildings in that stretch of road. Maybe the angle had been different, or the moonlight had played tricks on my eyes. But I kept coming back to how vivid and warm those lights had appeared, how lived in and welcoming the place had looked. I still take that route sometimes, and I always slow down when I pass that house. It's never shown any signs of life again, and I've never figured out what I saw that night. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone in the dark, I find myself hoping to see those lights again, even though the memory fills me with more unease than comfort. There's something deeply unsettling about a house that can appear full of life one moment and abandoned the next. The poster witnessed something that challenged their basic understanding of reality. Buildings don't suddenly transform from warm and welcoming to derelict and empty. Yet that's exactly what happened, leaving them to question not just what they saw, but whether they can trust their own perceptions. Our next story proves that even the most routine stops can become gateways to experiences we can't explain. I was driving cross-country and had been on the road for about 8 hours straight. It was well past midnight when I saw a rest stop sign and decided I really needed to stretch my legs and use the bathroom. The place was almost deserted, just my car and a couple of semis parked under the dim lights. The security building looked typical for a highway rest stop: cinder block construction, fluorescent lighting, and that institutional cleanliness that somehow manages to feel dirty anyway. I pushed through the heavy door and was hit with that familiar mix of industrial disinfectant and stale air. As I walked toward the restrooms, I heard someone crying. It was a woman's voice, soft but clearly distressed, coming from inside the women's bathroom. The sound made me hesitate. I wanted to help if someone was in trouble, but I also didn't want to intrude on a private moment. I stood there for a minute, listening. The crying continued, a steady, heartbroken sobbing that made my chest tight with sympathy. It sounded like someone experiencing real grief, not just frustration or tiredness. Finally, I knocked gently on the bathroom door and called out, asking if everything was okay. The crying stopped immediately, but no one answered. I waited another moment, then pushed the door open slightly and called in again. The bathroom was small, just 3 stalls and a couple of sinks. I could see under all the stall doors, and there were no feet visible anywhere. I stepped inside and checked each stall door. They were all unlocked and empty, but as soon as I stepped back out into the main area, the crying started again. Same voice, same heartbroken tone, definitely coming from inside that bathroom. I went back in, and again, complete silence and emptiness. This happened 3 more times. Each time I left the bathroom, the crying would resume. Each time I entered, it would stop, and I'd find the space completely vacant. There was nowhere for someone to hide. No vents large enough for a person, no storage areas, no other exits. I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled, but I still needed to use the facilities. I went into one of the stalls and tried to hurry, But the whole time I was in there, I could hear that woman crying just outside my stall door. The sound was so close, it felt like she was standing right next to me. But when I looked under the door, I saw nothing but empty floor. When I finished and opened the stall door, the crying stopped again. The bathroom was silent and empty, but I could feel a presence lingering in the air, like the emotional residue of intense sadness. I washed my hands quickly and got out of there. As I walked back to my car, I could hear the crying resume one more time, muffled now by the bathroom walls, but still audible across the parking lot. I've stopped at a lot of rest areas since then, and I've never experienced anything like that again. But sometimes, when I'm at a particularly isolated stop late at night, I find myself listening carefully for sounds that shouldn't be there. The poster encountered something that defied every logical explanation. A voice without a body, grief without a source. Rest stops are liminal spaces where travelers pause between destinations, but this one seemed to hold something that couldn't move on. The emotional weight of someone's sorrow had somehow become trapped in that bathroom, replaying endlessly for anyone unlucky enough to hear it. Sometimes, the most disturbing encounters happen in our most intimate spaces. As our next storyteller discovered, my wife and I had just brought our 3-month-old son home from the hospital after a minor procedure. Nothing serious, just some routine tests that required an overnight stay. We were both exhausted and grateful to be back in our own house, with our baby sleeping peacefully in his crib. We'd set up the baby monitor like we always did, the camera unit in his nursery, and the receiver on our bedside table. Our son had been sleeping soundly for about 2 hours when the monitor crackled to life around 1 a.m. At first, we heard the normal static and ambient noise that these devices pick up, but then a woman's voice came through the speaker, clear as day. "He's awake now." My wife and I both sat up immediately, looking at each other with confusion. The voice wasn't either of ours, and it definitely wasn't coming from our baby, who we could see on the monitor screen was still fast asleep, exactly as we'd left him. I grabbed the receiver and checked all the settings. The device was definitely connected to our camera in the nursery. There was no way it could be picking up signals from another house. We live in a rural area with our nearest neighbors more than a quarter mile away. We crept down the hall to check on our son in person. He was sleeping deeply, his breathing steady and peaceful. The nursery was exactly as we'd left it. Dim nightlight, soft music from his white noise machine, nothing out of place. But as we stood there watching him sleep, the monitor in our bedroom crackled again. We could hear it from down the hall, that same woman's voice repeating, "He's awake now." This back time, my wife ran to our room to grab the monitor while I stayed with the baby. She confirmed that the voice was definitely coming through our device, even though she was looking right at our peacefully sleeping child. We spent the rest of the night taking turns sitting in the nursery. The voice came through the monitor 3 more times over the next few hours, always the same phrase, "He's awake now." Each time, our son was obviously sound asleep. The next day, I took the monitor back to the store where we'd bought it. The staff tested it thoroughly and found nothing wrong with the device. They said interference from other electronics was possible, but couldn't explain how another signal would be so clear and consistent. We bought a different brand of monitor, but I still get chills thinking about that voice. Someone or something was watching our baby and commenting on his state, even when we could see with our own eyes that he was sleeping. I just can't figure out who that woman was or how she could see into our nursery. The most sacred spaces in our homes are supposed to be safe from outside intrusion, especially our children's bedrooms. The poster experienced a violation of that safety when an unknown woman's voice began monitoring their baby through their own security device. Technology that was meant to provide peace of mind instead became a conduit for something unsettling and unexplained. Our next encounter takes us to the great outdoors, where the simple act of walking alone becomes something far more complex. I love hiking, especially on the less popular trails where you can really feel like you're getting away from civilization. Last month, I decided to tackle a moderate trail I'd never tried before, about 6 miles through mixed forest with some decent elevation changes. The trailhead parking was empty when I arrived around 2 p.m, which was perfect. I prefer solitary hikes where I can move at my own pace and really connect with nature. The weather was ideal, crisp but not cold, with good visibility through the trees. About 2 miles in, I started hearing footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own steps bouncing off the trees. But when I stopped to take a drink of water, I realized the footsteps continued for a few beats after mine stopped. I turned around and looked back down the trail. It was empty as far as I could see, which was about 50 yards before the path curved out of sight. I called out a friendly hello, thinking maybe another hiker was approaching and just hadn't come into view yet. No response, the normal. Just forest sounds, birds, wind in the leaves, my own breathing. I started walking again, and within a few steps, there were the footsteps behind me. They matched my pace, exactly, like someone was deliberately trying to stay in sync with my movement. When I walked faster, they sped up. When I slowed down, they did too. This continued for the next mile. Every time I stopped and turned around, the trail was empty. Every time I called out, no one answered. But as soon as I resumed walking, those footsteps would resume too, always perfectly matched to my rhythm. I started to feel genuinely unnerved. The forest around me was thick enough that someone could theoretically be moving parallel to the hidden trail, staying in the trees, but the footsteps sounded like they were coming from directly behind me on the path itself. Around mile 4, I decided to test what was happening. I stepped off the trail completely and hid behind a large tree trunk, staying perfectly still and quiet. If someone was following me, they'd either have to pass by my hiding spot or stop and reveal their position. I waited for about 10 minutes, listening carefully. The forest was completely quiet, except for natural sounds. No footsteps, no movement, no indication that anyone else was nearby. When I stepped back onto the trail and started walking again, the footsteps immediately resumed. Same rhythm, same distance behind me, like whoever it was had been patiently waiting for me to continue. I picked up my pace significantly for the last 2 miles, almost jogging at times. The footsteps kept up effortlessly, never falling behind or getting closer, maintaining that exact same distance behind me. When I finally reached my car at the trailhead, I turned around one last time to look back at the trail. Empty. I sat my car for about 20 minutes, watching to see if anyone else would emerge from the woods. No one did. According to the trail register, I was the only person who had signed in that day. I've been back to other trails since then, but I haven't returned to that one. Sometimes when I'm hiking alone, I find myself listening extra carefully to my own footsteps, making sure they don't have any unexpected echoes following behind. The poster experienced something that touched on one of our most primal fears, being followed by something we can't see or identify. The perfect synchronization of those phantom footsteps suggested intelligence and intent, yet there was never any evidence of another person on the trail. It's the kind of encounter that makes you question whether you're truly alone in places where you think you are. Our next story reminds us that even our own homes aren't always the sanctuaries we believe them to be. I was having trouble sleeping one night, probably due to too much caffeine and earlier in the day, so I decided to go downstairs and watch some TV until I felt drowsy. My living room has these large windows that face the street, and I usually keep the curtains open because I like the way the streetlights create a soft glow in the room. I've been channel surfing for maybe 20 minutes when something made me look toward the window. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or maybe shadows from a passing car, but then my blood went cold. There was a face pressed against the glass, staring directly at me. It was pale, almost luminescent in the dim light from the street. The features were human, but somehow wrong. The eyes too wide, the mouth slightly open like they were trying to say something, but couldn't make any sound. What scared me most was how perfectly still it was, like a photograph of a face just floating there in the darkness. I jumped up from the couch and fumbled for my phone, never taking my eyes off that window. The face didn't react to my movement at all. It just kept staring with those unnaturally wide eyes, completely motionless. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial 911, but I managed to get through and explain what was happening. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and move away from the windows while officers were en route. I backed into the hallway, still watching that face through the doorway. It remained in exactly the same position, pressed against the glass like it had been painted there. I kept expecting it to move or disappear, but it never did. The police arrived within about 8 minutes, though it felt like hours. I watched through my front door peephole as 2 officers approached the house with flashlights. One of them walked directly to the living room window where I'd seen the face. Nothing was there. The officers searched my entire yard, checking for footprints or any sign that someone had been standing outside my window. The ground beneath that window was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding impressions. But there were no footprints, no disturbed soil, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. They filed a report and suggested I install motion sensor lights, but I could tell they thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I did. Maybe the stress from work and lack of sleep had finally caught up with me. But I can't shake the memory of that pale face staring through my window, or the way it never moved or blinked the entire time I was watching it. I've installed blackout curtains in my living room now. I'd rather sit in complete darkness than risk seeing that face again. The poster experienced every homeowner's worst nightmare, the feeling of being watched from outside their own windows. What makes this encounter particularly disturbing is the complete absence of any physical evidence that someone had been there. When reality leaves no trace but memory remains vivid, we're left questioning our own minds. Sometimes, the most terrifying encounters are the ones that make us doubt our own perceptions, leaving us wondering what else might be watching us from places where no one should be able to stand. Sometimes the road itself becomes a character in our darkest experiences, as our storyteller discovered on what should have been a routine drive. I was driving back from my cousin's wedding, a route I'd taken dozens of times over the years. It's mostly highway with a few small towns scattered along the way, nothing complicated about it. The reception had run late, so I didn't leave until almost midnight, but I'm comfortable night driving at and the roads were clear. About an hour into the drive, I needed gas, so I pulled into a station I'd never noticed before. It was one of those older places with just a few pumps and a small convenience store attached. The clerk inside was friendly enough, a middle-aged guy who nodded when I came in to pay. I bought some coffee and a candy bar for the road, and we made small talk about the late hour and how quiet the highways get after midnight. Nothing memorable about the interaction, just two people being polite to each other. I got back on the highway and continued driving. The coffee helped me stay alert, and I was making good time. I figured I'd be home within another hour and a half, but then I started recognizing landmarks that seemed too familiar. That same distinctive water tower, the same billboard advertising a local restaurant, the same overpass with the unusual curved design. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, that all small towns start to look alike when you're driving at night. Then I saw the gas station again. Same location, same layout, same flickering sign out front. I slowed down as I passed, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was definitely the same place where I'd stopped for gas, but that was impossible. I'd been driving straight down the highway for over an hour. I kept going, thinking maybe there was a chain of identical stations along this route. But 20 minutes later, I passed it again. Same pumps, same building, same everything. This time I pulled over and checked my GPS. According to the device, I was exactly where I should be, making normal progress toward home. But I knew I'd seen that station 3 times now, which shouldn't have been possible unless I was driving in circles somehow. I decided to stop and ask for directions, even though I knew the route by heart. The same clerk was behind the counter, looking exactly as he had an hour earlier. I must have looked confused or concerned because he smiled and said, "You're the third one tonight." "Third what?" I asked. "Third driver to come back here looking lost." "Don't worry, happens sometimes on this stretch of road. Just keep going straight. You'll break through eventually." Breakthrough? I wanted to ask what he meant, but something about his calm acceptance of the situation made me more nervous than reassured. I bought another coffee I didn't need and got back on the road. I drove for another 45 minutes, watching my odometer carefully and paying attention to every mile marker. According to all the signs and my GPS, I was making steady progress. Sure enough, I passed that same gas station a 4th time. This time I didn't stop. I just kept driving, gripping the steering wheel tighter and trying not to panic. Whatever was happening, stopping didn't seem to help. Finally, around 4 in the morning, I passed a landmark I hadn't seen before, a different water tower advertising a town I recognized as being close to home. From that point on, the drive proceeded normally, and I made it home without any more strange repetitions. I've driven that route several times since then, always during daylight hours. I've never been able to find that gas station again. No matter how carefully I look for it, that stretch of highway just shows the normal mix of farmland and forest, with no service stations for 30 miles in either direction. The poster found themselves trapped in something that defied geography itself, a loop in reality where the same location kept appearing despite traveling in a straight line. The clerk's casual mention of other drivers experiencing the same thing suggests this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather something that happens regularly on that particular stretch of road. Some places seem to exist outside our normal understanding of space and distance, creating pockets where the usual rules simply don't apply. The fact that the gas station vanished completely from subsequent trips only adds to the mystery of what the poster experienced during those dark hours on an impossible highway. Our next story comes from someone who learned that even the most mundane workplaces can harbor mysteries that follow you home. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. It's one of those places truckers stop at for coffee and pie. Nothing fancy, just fluorescent lights and vinyl booths that have seen better decades. Most nights are quiet, especially after 2 in the morning, when even the truckers have found places to rest. Last Tuesday started like any other shift. I was wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers when I noticed him sitting in the corner booth. Middle-aged guy in a worn denim jacket, nursing a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. Nothing unusual about that. We get plenty of insomniacs and night owls who just want somewhere warm to sit. What caught my attention was how still he was. Most people fidget, check their phones, look around. This guy just stared straight ahead at the wall, his hands folded on the table like he was praying. His coffee cup sat untouched, steam long gone. I walked over to ask if he wanted a refill, but when I got close enough to see his face clearly, my stomach dropped. His eyes were open but completely white, like someone had rolled them back in his head. But he was sitting upright, perfectly balanced, as if he was wide awake and alert. I backed away slowly, not wanting to startle him if he was having some kind of medical episode. I went to the kitchen to call for an ambulance, but when I came back out front, the booth was empty. The coffee cup was gone too, and there was exact change for the coffee sitting on the table, down to the penny. I checked the parking lot through the window. Empty, except for my car and a semi-truck that had been there since before my shift started. No other vehicles, no sign of where the man could have gone. The strangest part was the receipt tape from our register. I always print a receipt when someone pays, it's automatic. But there was no record of anyone paying for coffee during my entire shift. According to the machine, I hadn't made a single sale between midnight and 5 in the morning. I've worked 3 more Tuesday night shifts since then, and each time, around the same time, I see that same man in the same booth. Same denim jacket, same untouched coffee, same white eyes staring at the wall. And each time, when I work up the courage to approach him, he vanishes before I can get close enough to speak. My manager says I should see a doctor about stress. Maybe she's right, but I can't explain away that exact change sitting on the table every time, or the way the register has no memory of transactions that I know happened. I'm thinking about requesting day shifts. The poster encountered something that challenges our basic understanding of how reality operates. A customer who appears solid enough to order coffee and leave payment, but who exists outside the normal record-keeping systems we depend on to make sense of the world. The fact that this happens repeatedly on a schedule suggests something more than a simple hallucination or misperception. Sometimes the most unsettling encounters happen in places where we're supposed to feel most secure, as our next storyteller discovered during what should have been a peaceful evening at home. My building is apartment old, but well maintained. The kind of place where you know your neighbors and feel safe walking the halls alone. I've lived there for 3 years without incident, which is why what happened last month shook me so badly. I was in my kitchen making dinner around 7 in the evening when I heard my doorbell ring. Nothing unusual about that, except when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. I figured maybe it was a delivery person who had already moved on to another apartment, so I went back to cooking. 10 minutes later, the bell rang again. Same thing, empty hallway. This time I opened the door and looked up and down the corridor. Nobody, and all the other apartment doors were closed. I called out asking if anyone needed help, but got no response. The third time it happened, I was ready. I positioned myself right by the door so I could open it the moment I heard the bell. I counted to 3 after the ring and yanked the door open as fast as I could. The hallway was empty, but I could smell something strange. It was like old flowers, the way roses smell when they've been sitting in water too long and started to rot. The scent was so strong it made my eyes water, but it faded quickly, gone completely within seconds. I went downstairs to talk to Mrs. Chen, who lives directly below me. She's retired and home most of the time, so I figured if someone was playing pranks in the building, she might have seen them. But when I described what was happening, her face went pale. She told me that the previous tenant in my apartment, an elderly woman named Rose, had died suddenly in her sleep about 6 months before I moved in. Mrs. Chen had been the one to find her when Rose didn't answer her door for 3 days running. Apparently Rose had been in the habit of ringing other people's doorbells when she got confused about which apartment was hers, something that happened more frequently in her final months. I thanked Mrs. Chen for the information, but I didn't really believe in that kind of explanation. Dead people don't ring doorbells. There had to be a logical reason for what was happening. But the next 2, over weeks, it kept happening. Always around dinner time, always 3 rings exactly, and always that smell of dying flowers that would appear and disappear so quickly, I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined it. I started timing the rings and noticed they happened at almost exactly the same intervals Rose would have been coming home from her evening walk, according to Mrs. Chen. 7 o'clock, 7:10, 7:20, like clockwork. Last week, I decided to try something. When the first ring came, instead of looking through the peephole, I opened the door immediately and said, "Hello, Rose. This is your apartment now, your home." The smell of flowers filled the hallway, stronger than ever before. But this time, it smelled fresh, like a garden in full bloom. It lasted for nearly a minute before fading away. The doorbell hasn't rung since then. The poster found a way to provide peace to someone who seemed lost between worlds. Sometimes the encounters that frighten us most are simply appeals for help or recognition from those who can't find their way home. The transformation of the scent from decay to fresh flowers suggests that acknowledgement and kindness can sometimes resolve even the most inexplicable situations. Our next story takes us to a place where technology and the unexplained intersect in deeply uncomfortable ways. I work in IT for a small company, so I'm used to staying late when systems need updating or maintenance. The office building is mostly empty after 6, just security guards and the occasional workaholic pulling long hours. I actually prefer working at night because there are fewer interruptions and I can focus better on complex problems. Last month, I was troubleshooting a server issue that had been causing network slowdowns all week. It was detailed work, the kind that requires absolute concentration. So I'd put on my headphones and settled in for what I knew would be a long night. Around 11 o'clock, I got an email notification that made me pause. It was from my own email address, sent to my own email address. The subject line just said, "Look up." I stared at the screen for a moment, trying to figure out how that was possible. Our email system has safeguards against that kind of loop. And besides, I hadn't sent myself any messages. I opened the email, but the body was blank except for those 2 words repeated over and over. "Look up, look up, look up." I did look up, scanning the empty office around me. Cubicles, computer monitors, the usual office furniture. Nothing out of place. Nothing that would explain why someone would want me to look up. I figured it had to be some kind of system glitch, maybe a corrupted message that got misdirected. I went back to work, but 5 minutes later, another email arrived from myself. This time the subject line said, "Behind you," and the body contained the same repetitive text. Just those 2 words over and over again. My skin prickled as I slowly turned around in my chair. The office behind me was dark, except for the security lighting, empty as it should be at that hour. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that I was missing something important. I decided to check the email server logs to see where these messages were actually coming from. What I found made my blood run cold. According to the logs, the emails were being sent from my own computer, from my own terminal, at the exact times I received them. But I wasn't sending them. I ran a full security scan, checked for malware, looked for any sign that my computer had been compromised. Everything came back clean. As far as the system was concerned, I was sending emails to myself and had been doing so for the past 20 minutes. A third email arrived while I was running the diagnostics. Subject line, "Turn around slowly." Body text, the same repetitive words, but this time they were interspersed with something else. "I'm right here, I'm right here, I'm right here." I spun around in my chair, heart hammering, but the office was still empty. Security cameras showed no movement anywhere in the building, except for guards making their rounds 3 floors below. I was alone, but somehow not alone. The emails kept coming every few minutes, each one more urgent than the last. "Don't ignore me. I need help. Why won't you look at me?" All sent from my own address, all claiming to originate from my own computer. I finally gathered the courage to respond to one of the messages, typing back, "Who are you? What do you want?" The response came instantly. "I used to work here, 3rd cubicle from the window. I never left. I knew that cubicle. It had been empty for months, ever since the company had done layoffs in the spring. I walked over to it, my footsteps echoing in the empty office. The desk was clean, computer removed, but there was still a faded nameplate. David Martinelli, Systems Administrator. I remembered David, quiet guy, good at his job, had worked there for almost 15 years before getting caught in the budget cuts. I'd heard through the grapevine that he'd taken the layoff pretty hard, but I didn't know him well enough to reach out. When I got back to my desk, there was one final email waiting. "Thank you for remembering me." I never received another message from my own email address, but I did some research the next day and learned that David Martinelli had died in a car accident 2 weeks after being laid off. The funeral had been small, mostly family, and and the company hadn't sent anyone to represent the office where he'd spent most of his adult life. I requested that they put his nameplate back on his old cubicle, along with a small plant. It seemed like the right thing to do for someone who had never really left. The poster encountered something that suggests death doesn't always mean departure, especially for those whose lives were deeply connected to their workplaces. David's digital ghost, reaching out through the very systems he once maintained, speaks to how technology can become a bridge between worlds. Sometimes, the most profound hauntings aren't about fear, but about the human need to be remembered and acknowledged. The boundaries between sleep and waking can blur in unsettling ways, as our next storyteller learned during what should have been a routine overnight stay. I was visiting my sister in Portland and decided to spend an extra night rather than make the long drive home after a full day of sightseeing. I booked a room at a budget motel near the highway. Nothing fancy, but clean and convenient. The kind of place where you sleep with one eye open, but don't expect any real problems. The room was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot. Standard motel layout with thin walls and that particular smell of industrial carpet cleaner mixed with decades of cigarette smoke. I'd stayed in worse places, so I settled in and tried to get comfortable, despite the lumpy mattress and noisy air conditioning unit. I must have fallen asleep around midnight, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of my own voice. I could hear myself talking, but I wasn't the one speaking. The voice was coming from somewhere else in the room, having what sounded like a phone conversation. "Yes, I understand," my voice said. "I'll be there soon." I sat up in bed, fully alert now, trying to figure out what was happening. The voice was definitely mine, same tone and inflection, but I was lying in bed with my mouth shut. It was like hearing a recording of myself, except I knew I wasn't playing any recordings. "No, don't worry about that," my voice continued. "I've already taken care of everything." I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around the room, empty except for me and my luggage. No phone, no radio, no TV that could be playing back some kind of recording. But the conversation continued, my voice responding to someone I couldn't hear. "Tomorrow night will be perfect. She'll never see it coming." That's when I really started to panic. My voice was talking about someone in the third person, someone female, and the tone was cold in a way I'd never heard from myself. It was like listening to a stranger who happened to have my exact voice discussing something terrible. I got up and searched every inch of the room, looking for speakers, recording devices, anything that could explain what I was hearing. Nothing. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room but having no source. "The motel room is perfect," my voice said. "Isolated, no witnesses. Cleanup will be easy." I grabbed my phone and started recording, but when I played back the audio, there was nothing but silence and my own panicked breathing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't being picked up by my phone's microphone. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, my voice discussing logistics for something that sounded like a planned murder, details about timing, methods, disposal of evidence, all spoken in my exact voice, but describing actions I would never consider taking. Finally, I heard my voice say, "I have to go now. She's waking up." The room fell silent. I stood there in the lamplight, shaking, trying to process what I'd just experienced. I packed my things immediately and left the motel, driving straight through the night to get home. I never found out who the she in that conversation was supposed to be, or what my voice had been planning. But the next morning, I saw a news report about a woman who had been found dead in a motel room in Portland. Same chain as where I'd stayed, different location across town. The police said it looked like suicide, but her family insisted she had no reason to take her own life. The case was still under investigation when I last checked. I don't know if there's any connection between what I heard and what happened to that woman. I hope not, but I can't shake the feeling that I somehow overheard a conversation between my sleeping self and something else, something that uses our voices to discuss things our waking minds would never contemplate. The poster glimpsed something that suggests our identities might be more fragmented than we realize. The idea that our voices can be borrowed by forces beyond our control touches on deep fears about autonomy and self-determination. The timing connection with the real death makes this encounter particularly chilling, raising questions about whether some dreams are actually windows into parallel possibilities or darker realities. Sometimes, the most ordinary locations become stages for experiences that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of time and space. I work as a night security guard at a small office complex, kind of place where insurance agents and tax preparers rent cheap space. It's quiet work, mostly just walking the halls every few hours and making sure all the doors are locked. The building is old but well maintained, with long corridors and fluorescent lighting that hums constantly. About 6 months into the job, I started noticing something odd during my rounds. On the 3rd floor, there's a hallway that runs the length of the building, with offices on both sides. Simple layout, nothing complicated about it. But sometimes when I walked down that hallway, it seemed longer than it should be. At first I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on my perception. Night shifts can mess with your sense of time and distance, especially in a building where every hallway looks similar. But as weeks passed, I became certain that the hallway was actually changing length. Some nights I could walk from one end to the other in about 30 seconds, which seemed right for the distance. But other nights, the same walk would take 3 or 4 minutes, and I'd count my steps to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The hallway would literally be longer, with more doors, more distance between the elevator and the emergency exit at the far end. I started keeping a log, noting which nights the hallway felt normal and which nights it stretched out. There was no pattern I could identify, no connection to weather or moon phases or anything else that might explain the variation. The really strange part was the extra doors that would appear on the longer nights. The hallway normally has 12 offices, 6 on each side, but when it stretched out, there would be 14 or 16 doors, sometimes even 18. The additional doors all looked identical to the regular office doors, complete with suite numbers and nameplates. I tried opening some of the extra doors, but they were always locked. The nameplates showed businesses that didn't exist in the building directory: Temporal Solutions LLC, Yesterday and Associates, Kronos Consulting Group. Names that seemed designed to mock what I was experiencing. One night, when the hallway was at its longest, I decided to time myself walking the entire length while counting my steps. It took me nearly 6 minutes and over 400 steps to reach the end. The same distance that usually took 30 seconds and about 60 steps. I brought a measuring tape the next night, but of course that was one of the normal nights when everything was back to standard dimensions. 63 feet from elevator to emergency exit, exactly what the building plan showed. I've been working there for over a year now, and the stretching still happens. I've learned to just accept it as part of the job. Some nights, I walk down a normal hallway, and some nights, I walk through what feels like a tunnel that extends far beyond the physical boundaries of the building. The strangest part is that I've grown to prefer the longer nights. There's something peaceful about walking through that extended space, past doors that lead nowhere and businesses that don't exist. It's like the building is dreaming, and on those nights, I get to walk through its dreams. I've never told my supervisor about it. How do you explain that the building you're paid to guard sometimes rearranges itself? That hallways can stretch and contract like living things? That some nights, the architecture itself seems to be alive? I just do my rounds, note the time in my log, and accept that some mysteries are better experienced than explained. The poster found a way to coexist with the impossible, treating their building's temporal fluctuations as just another aspect of the job. There's something beautiful about learning to find peace in the inexplicable rather than fighting against it. Sometimes, acceptance of mystery is more valuable than understanding, especially when the mystery seems benign and even comforting in its own strange way. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey through the spaces where reality bends and breaks. These stories remind us that the world we think we know so well is actually far more mysterious than we dare to imagine. From hotel hallways, where strangers stand motionless for hours, to mountain cabins visited by footsteps that leave no trace, to phones that call themselves with warnings we can't understand. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary moments. See you again soon. You